Nolan Fexley had always been the quiet, withdrawn boy that Morella raised with love and care, until the day she uncovered a dark, horrifying secret buried beneath their home. What seemed like a typical suburban life quickly spiraled into a nightmare that no one could have foreseen. As the truth slowly unraveled, Morella was forced to confront the unthinkable. Her own son was capable of a crime so chilling, so calculated, that it would haunt their family and the entire town forever. Tara Dane, a bright and energetic 15-year-old girl, had always been known for her adventurous spirit. She lived in a small, tight-knit town where everyone knew everyone. Tara's life was simple and full of the usual teenage thrills: school, hanging out with friends, and the occasional disagreement with her overprotective parents. That was until one late afternoon when everything changed. It was the kind of day that felt like any other, but it would soon turn into something no one could have ever predicted. On the day Tara went missing, the weather had been unremarkable, cloudy, skies with a slight chill in the air. Tara had spent the afternoon at school, talking about plans for the weekend and catching up with her friends. She told her best friend Sophie that she was going to walk home that day. It wasn't far, and she often enjoyed the time alone, letting her thoughts drift as she passed the quiet houses and trees that lined the street. The walk was routine, something she'd done countless times before. Nothing felt out of place. But as the minutes turned into hours, Tara never made it home. Her mother, Kelly Dane, grew frantic as the sun began to set, and Tara still hadn't arrived. At first, Kelly thought maybe her daughter had stopped by a friend's house or had gotten distracted. But when the hours passed and she still didn't answer her phone, worry began to settle in. Kelly called Tara's friends, but none of them had seen her. Panic surged through Kelly's veins, and she immediately contacted the local authorities, the KI. Police arrived quickly, canvassing the area and knocking on doors. They checked the nearby shops, the park, and the places Tara might have gone, but there was no trace of her. The search began the next day, with neighbors, volunteers, and law enforcement combing through every inch of the town. They checked the woods behind Tara's neighborhood, the small stream that ran nearby, and even the old abandoned house down the street where kids sometimes gathered. There was no sign of Tara. Detective Lorne Whitaker, a seasoned investigator with a sharp eye for detail, was called in. He immediately sensed that this case was different. He was no stranger to missing persons, but there was something unsettling about the situation. Tara wasn't the type to run away or disappear without a reason. She was a good student, well-liked, and close to her family. It didn't add up. Whitaker knew that something had happened to her. But what? And who could be behind it? For days there were no leads. The town was on edge. Flyers with Tara's photo were posted on every street corner, and news outlets picked up the story, broadcasting it across the state. Morella Fexley, Nolan's mother, was one of the first to join the search efforts. She knew Tara from the neighborhood and offered her help, though she had never been close to the girl. Nolan, her son, had always kept to himself and rarely interacted with the other kids. Still, Morella had a sense of concern for the missing girl. Like many others, she wanted answers. Nolan, on the other hand, seemed oddly distant. He didn't speak much about the missing girl, not even when his mother asked if he had seen anything unusual. Nolan was a quiet teenager, introverted and withdrawn. He spent most of his time in his room, absorbed in his video games or reading about obscure topics online. His behavior was not out of the ordinary, at least not to Morella. She assumed her son was simply going through a phase, a normal part of growing up. But the unease was palpable. Neighbors began whispering about Nolan, their suspicions growing each day that Tara remained missing. Morella, though, refused to believe that her son was involved in any way. Nolan was her child, the one person she had worked so hard to protect and raise on her own. She brushed off any talk of him being a suspect. Still, the whispers continued, and Detective Whitaker began to take a closer look at Nolan, even though there was no concrete evidence to suggest that he was anything more than an innocent bystander in a case that seemed to have no answers. Days turned into weeks. The search for Tara grew colder, but the mystery only deepened. Morella tried to carry on with her life, but the weight of the situation hung over her like a storm cloud. She had no idea that the answers she was desperately searching for were much closer than she could have ever imagined. The more she tried to focus on her son, the more certain things felt off. Nolan, so silent, so withdrawn, seemed more distant than ever. But in her heart, Morella couldn't bear to believe that the boy she raised could be hiding such a dark secret. Then came the moment when everything would change. The moment when Morella's life and the lives of everyone in the town would be shattered forever. As the weeks dragged on, the town's sense of calm began to erode. Neighbors and friends were still searching for Tara, yet every passing day without answers made the possibility of finding her alive seem less and less likely. The local authorities, though tirelessly working on the case, had no new leads. Detective Lorne Whitaker's face had become a fixture in town, his stern eyes scanning every potential lead, but there was no breakthrough. The case had started to grow cold. Nolan Fexley, Nolan's mother, found herself caught between her growing worry and a deep sense of disbelief. She had spent every moment searching, calling, and reaching out to the authorities for any kind of new information about Tara. But at home, things seemed strangely quiet. Nolan kept to himself in his room, just as he always had. His silence was deafening, but Morella couldn't bring herself to believe that her son, the boy she had raised alone, was involved in any of the horrors that might have befallen Tara. He had always been different, yes, but not dangerous. Still, something was off. Over the past few days, she had noticed an odd, unpleasant odor drifting up from the basement. At first, she thought it was the smell of dampness. Maybe a small animal had gotten trapped beneath the house. The basement of their home wasn't particularly well maintained, but Morella had never thought much about it before. It wasn't until the smell worsened that she began to wonder what it could be. It wasn't just the usual musty smell of an old house. It was something far worse, something that set her nerves on edge. Morella was often busy with work, trying to pay the bills and keep the household running, but the stench had become impossible to ignore. It lingered in the air, even creeping into the rooms upstairs. She tried opening the windows, lighting candles, and spraying air fresheners, but nothing seemed to help. The smell grew stronger, more pungent each day. There was something about it that made her stomach turn. It smelled metallic, almost like blood. But how could that be? The thought seemed impossible. Still, as much as she tried to push it away, the smell became a constant presence in her home. It was one evening, after a particularly long day of searching for Tara, that Morella decided to investigate the source of the odor. She knew the house wasn't in the best condition, but she never expected to find anything alarming. She grabbed a flashlight and walked downstairs into the dimly lit basement, her footsteps echoing on the cold cement floor. The further she walked toward the back of the basement, the stronger the stench became. She frowned, thinking it must be an animal trapped somewhere, maybe beneath the old wooden beams near the back of the room. The basement was filled with old furniture, boxes, and discarded items. Morella had always kept things stored away in the basement. Furniture she didn't use anymore, old clothes and other belongings she hadn't yet parted with. But as she reached the back corner of the room, she noticed something strange. There were scratch marks on one of the wooden beams, as though something, or someone, had been trying to get out. She bent down to examine the marks, and that's when she saw it. A small piece of fabric, a light pink color, was wedged between the wood. It was torn and stained with dirt, but it was unmistakable. It wasn't something that belonged to her or Nolan. Her heart skipped a beat. She reached for the fabric, her hand trembling. As she examined it closely, she realized it looked like part of a shirt, something a young girl might wear. But why would it be here, in the basement, buried under layers of dust and debris? Morella's mind raced, her thoughts immediately jumping to Tara. Could it be that Tara had somehow been here? But how? And why hadn't Nolan said anything about it? The more she thought about it, the more she realized that Nolan had been acting strangely in the days since Tara's disappearance. He had become more withdrawn, more distant. He had always been a quiet child, but now he seemed almost completely detached from everything happening around him. He never asked about Tara. He didn't seem to care about the search. Morella tried to push away the thought. She refused to believe that her son could have anything to do with this. But the more she uncovered, the harder it was to ignore the unsettling feeling growing in her gut. When Nolan came home that evening, Morella decided to confront him. She asked about the fabric she had found, about the smell in the basement. Nolan's response was typical. He seemed indifferent, almost annoyed that his mother was questioning him. He told her that he hadn't noticed anything strange, that it was probably just some old clothes or garbage. But his reaction didn't sit right with Morella. There was something in his eyes, a coldness, that made her question everything. That night, Morella couldn't sleep. She lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying the events in her mind. She knew something was wrong, but she couldn't bring herself to admit it. She didn't want to believe it. But the pieces of the puzzle were starting to fit together in ways that made her heart race with fear. The next morning, she found herself standing at the foot of the basement stairs again, unable to shake the sense of dread that had settled in her chest. She knew that whatever was hidden beneath her house was something that she wasn't ready to face. But it was only a matter of time before the truth would come to light, and Morella knew, deep down, that the truth was far darker than she ever could have imagined. As the days passed, the weight of Morella's discovery began to settle heavily on her shoulders. The fabric, the strange marks on the basement beam, and the overpowering stench that lingered in her home were all things she couldn't ignore any longer. She had hoped that by simply dismissing it, the unease would fade, but it hadn't. Instead, the more she tried to push it from her mind, the more it consumed her thoughts. Morella knew she had to do something. But what? Her mind raced with conflicting emotions, confusion, fear, and, above all, disbelief. She couldn't shake the feeling that her son, Nolan, was somehow involved in the disappearance of Tara. But how could that be? Nolan, though distant and quiet, had never shown any violent tendencies. He was a boy who spent most of his time playing video games and reading books about history and science. He had never been the type to hurt anyone, or so Morella thought. The idea that her son could be hiding something so dark, so sinister, was almost impossible for her to comprehend. It was a cold morning when Morella decided to take matters into her own hands. She couldn't sit idly by any longer. The basement, the smell, and the fabric were enough to make her question everything. She knew that she had to dig deeper, but where could she go for answers? Who could she trust? She couldn't turn to Nolan. She had already tried talking to him, and he had brushed her off. She couldn't ask him outright, not with the way he had been acting lately. But she couldn't just stand by and wait for someone else to figure it out. The clock was ticking, and every second that passed without knowing the truth felt like an eternity. Morella decided to speak to Detective Lorne Whitaker again. Though she hadn't wanted to involve him further before, she felt she had no other choice. She needed his help. She needed someone with experience, someone who could see things from a different perspective. She hoped he could uncover what she couldn't, or more accurately, what she was too afraid to face. That afternoon, she called the detective and arranged a meeting at her home. When Detective Whitaker arrived, Morella was already waiting for him, her nerves frayed. He had seen the fear in her eyes before, but today it was different. There was something desperate in her expression, a quiet panic that she couldn't hide. "I've found something," she told him, her voice shaky but determined. "Something I can't ignore anymore." Detective Whitaker listened carefully. As Morella explained what she had discovered, the torn fabric, the strange marks, and the smell that had gotten worse over the past few days, she led him down to the basement, her hands trembling as she reached for the flashlight and shone it across the room. Whitaker's experienced eyes scanned the space, taking in the clutter and disarray. When he reached the back corner, where Morella had found the fabric, he paused, examining the spot carefully. His eyes narrowed as he inspected the scratch, marks on the beam, a frown crossing his face. "This isn't something we can ignore," he said quietly, his voice steady despite the growing tension in the air. "We need to dig deeper. I'll have the team come back tomorrow to search the entire area." Morella's heart pounded in her chest as Whitaker's words sunk in. She had suspected something for days, but hearing it confirmed by the detective felt like the ground beneath her feet had cracked open. What was hidden beneath her home? And, more chillingly, could Nolan really be involved in something so monstrous? The next day, Detective Whitaker returned with a team of forensic experts. They brought with them specialized equipment, including ground-penetrating radar to scan beneath the floorboards and identify any hidden spaces. As the team worked, Morella stood back, her eyes fixed on Nolan, who had been sitting in his room, as he did every day, completely oblivious to the growing storm around him. It didn't take long before the team discovered something. A small, hidden compartment in the basement, sealed off by a series of wooden panels. The compartment had been cleverly concealed, almost as if someone had taken great care to ensure it remained undetected. When the team pried open the panels, the air in the room seemed to shift. The smell that had been so overpowering now became suffocating. The sight that greeted them was one no one was prepared for. Inside the compartment were signs of a struggle. Scratches on the walls, a few broken objects scattered across the floor, and, most disturbingly, a small mattress stained with what appeared to be blood. The smell, now unmistakable, made Morella's stomach churn. But what struck her the hardest was the sight of Tara's belongings, her personal items, pieces of jewelry, and even her school uniform, carefully folded and placed on the mattress. It was clear now. Tara had been held here, confined to this space beneath the house. Morella could no longer deny the truth. Her own son had been hiding something horrific, and the truth was unfolding in front of her eyes. Detective Whitaker quickly took charge, instructing his team to carefully collect all evidence for forensic analysis. They documented everything, from the bloodstains to the items found in the compartment. As they worked, Morella stood in the corner of the room, unable to tear her eyes away from the horrifying discovery. She felt a wave of nausea wash over her, but more than that, she felt a deep sense of betrayal. Her son, the boy she had raised, had been hiding this darkness right under her roof. Nolan's reaction, when he was confronted, was eerily calm. He showed no emotion, no regret, as the investigators revealed the horrors they had found beneath the house. It was as if he had expected this moment to come, as if he had been waiting for someone to finally uncover the truth. Morella's world shattered that day. The boy she had loved, the boy she had raised, had hidden a secret so terrifying, so unfathomable, that nothing would ever be the same again. The realization that her son was capable of such evil turned her world upside down, and she knew, in that moment, that the life she once knew was gone forever. The aftermath of the discovery in the basement hit Morella like a tidal wave. Every corner of her home seemed haunted by the truth she had uncovered. The smell of blood, the remnants of Tara's belongings, and the haunting sight of the hidden compartment in the basement replayed in her mind over and over again. She couldn't stop herself from shaking, unable to process the magnitude of what had just been revealed. The boy she had raised, the one she had nurtured, was capable of unspeakable horrors. As the authorities continued their investigation, the town was left in shock. The story spread quickly, but most were reluctant to believe it at first. How could anyone believe that Nolan Fexley, the quiet, introverted boy who kept to himself, could be involved in such a crime? Yet the evidence was undeniable. In a town that had prided itself on its quiet, peaceful reputation, this was the unthinkable. People began to question their neighbors, their friends, their own families. If Nolan was capable of such a thing, what did that say about the people they thought they knew? Detective Whitaker and his team worked tirelessly, gathering all the evidence from the hidden compartment. They carefully documented every piece of clothing, every personal belonging, and every sign of Tara's presence in that dark, secret space. They also gathered the blood samples that had been found on the mattress and floorboards, sending them off for analysis to confirm what they feared. The blood belonged to Tara. She had been there, alive at one point, held captive in the very basement of Nolan's home. But where was she now? Morella's thoughts were consumed with one question. Where was Tara? The discovery of the hidden compartment only opened up more terrifying possibilities. What had Nolan done to her? Was she still alive? Morella couldn't bear the thought of what her son might have done to the girl she had once known as a neighbor, a friend. It seemed impossible to reconcile the sweet, quiet boy she had raised with the monster now being uncovered beneath her feet. In the days that followed, Nolan remained eerily quiet. When he was arrested and taken in for questioning, he offered little resistance. He sat there, his gaze hollow, his face emotionless, as the detectives tried to piece together what had happened. They asked him about Tara, about the basement, about the things they had found beneath the house, but Nolan never broke. He didn't show any sign of guilt, remorse, or even fear. Instead, he responded to every question with calm, measured answers that revealed nothing of his motives. He never once shed a tear. His indifference was chilling, and it left everyone, including the detectives, more unsettled than ever. Morella, still reeling from the discovery, was forced to face a terrifying truth. She couldn't avoid it any longer. She had raised a child, capable of something unspeakable, and it broke her heart in ways she never thought possible. She didn't know when the darkness had crept in, when her son had crossed a line she couldn't see, but it had been there, hidden beneath the surface, all along. Morella found herself alone in the house more often than not. She tried to go about her day, but every step she took felt weighted, as though the walls of the house were closing in around her. She no longer felt safe in the place she had once called home. Everywhere she looked, she saw the evidence of what had been hidden from her, and it was as though the house itself was suffocating her. The investigators, meanwhile, were beginning to uncover more disturbing details about Nolan's actions. They discovered that he had been actively researching methods of control and confinement, studying criminal behavior and psychology, and even watching disturbing videos online. It became increasingly clear that Nolan had been planning something for a long time. This wasn't a spontaneous act of violence. It was calculated, premeditated. Nolan had kept a journal, a collection of writings that detailed his thoughts, his feelings, and his twisted view of the world. It was in these pages that detectives began to see a glimpse into his mind, a mind filled with obsession, delusion, and anger. His journal entries spoke of his fascination with power, control, and dominance over others. But most chilling of all were the entries that described Tara in unsettling detail. It became clear that Nolan had fixated on her, targeting her as a victim long before he ever acted on his impulses. The police also discovered evidence that Nolan had been keeping tabs on Tara's movements for months. He knew where she went, who she spoke to, and when she would be home. He had been watching her long before the night she disappeared, and it seemed as though he had been planning her abduction for a long time. But no one could understand why. What had triggered this? What made Nolan, who had always been so withdrawn and distant, turn into someone capable of such brutality? No one had answers. It was as though Nolan had slipped into the depths of his own mind, shutting everyone out, until he was no longer recognizable. Morella sat in silence as the investigators continued to piece together the truth. She couldn't help but wonder how she had missed the signs, how she had failed to see the darkness growing in her son's soul. She had always thought that Nolan's silence was a phase, something he would eventually grow out of. But now, as the weight of the truth settled on her shoulders, she realized how wrong she had been. Nolan had been hiding a part of himself that was far more terrifying than she could ever have imagined. The town, too, was left in a state of disbelief. Tara's family struggled to come to terms with the fact that their daughter had been taken from them in such a horrific way. And for Morella, the world she had once known seemed like a distant memory, something she could never go back to. Her life, like so many others, had been irrevocably changed. Nolan's actions had destroyed everything, and nothing would ever be the same again. The trial began several months after Nolan's arrest, and by that time, the entire town had been consumed by the horror of what had happened. The small, tight-knit community that had once been a place of peace and familiarity now buzzed with whispers, fear, and disbelief. The case dominated every conversation. Neighbors who had known the Fexley family for years couldn't fathom how the quiet boy they had seen grow up had turned into the monster responsible for such a crime. The courtroom was filled with curious onlookers, reporters, and law enforcement officers, all eager to hear the details of what had transpired behind the closed doors of the Fexley household. Morella sat in the front row, her heart heavy with grief. Every day felt like an eternity, as though the trial was stretching time itself. She had already heard the worst of it, the details of the basement, the horrifying discovery of Tara's belongings, and the cold, detached way her son had behaved since his arrest. Still, hearing it all again in a public setting, in front of a room full of people, felt like a fresh wound. Every word seemed to cut deeper than the last, and each new piece of information chipped away at the person she had once believed her son to be. The prosecution presented a strong case. They outlined the disturbing evidence, the hidden compartment in the basement, the bloodstains that matched Tara's DNA, and the chilling journal entries that described Nolan's obsession with his victim. The prosecutor painted a picture of a young boy who had, over time, developed a twisted fixation on control and domination, leading to a horrifying crime. They didn't hesitate to show the jury the photos of the blood-stained mattress, the items found in the compartment, and the disturbing research Nolan had done into kidnapping and criminal psychology. The jury listened in rapt attention, unable to look away from the damning evidence being presented. As the trial wore on, it became clear that Nolan's actions were not impulsive but calculated. The defense, in contrast, tried to argue that Nolan's behavior could be attributed to mental illness, that his quiet demeanor and withdrawn nature had masked a deeper, more troubling condition. They painted him as a troubled teenager who had been unable to deal with the pressures of adolescence and had acted out in a way that could not be fully understood by those around him. But the prosecution pushed back, presenting experts who testified that Nolan's actions went far beyond the struggles of a typical teenager. The things he had done were premeditated, planned in advance with chilling precision. Morella's heart broke as she listened to the testimonies. She had spent years trying to make sense of her son's behavior, trying to understand why he was always so distant, so detached from the world around him. She had blamed herself, wondering if she had done something wrong, if there had been signs she missed. But now, hearing the details laid bare in the courtroom, she realized that this darkness had been festering for a long time, long before Tara's disappearance. Nolan's testimony, when it came, was as cold and emotionless as his behavior had been from the start. He sat in the witness stand, his eyes devoid of remorse, his expression blank as he described his actions. He spoke of his obsession with Tara, how he had watched her for months, how he had planned her abduction down to the smallest detail. His voice was monotone, his words devoid of any empathy or guilt. When asked why he had done it, Nolan simply shrugged and said, "Because I could." The simplicity of the answer sent a chill through the room. Morella couldn't bring herself to look at him. She had seen him every day of his life, watched him grow from a baby into a child, then into the teenager sitting before her now. But the boy on that witness stand was a stranger. The person who had once been her son had disappeared, replaced by someone entirely different, someone capable of unimaginable cruelty. The defense tried to argue that Nolan should be treated with compassion, that he was a victim of his own mental state, but it was clear that the jury wasn't buying it. They were appalled by the coldness of his actions, the deliberate nature of his crime, and the complete lack of remorse he displayed. No amount of pleading or mitigating circumstances could change the fact that Nolan Fexley had taken a life, and in doing so, had forever destroyed the lives of everyone around him. As the trial drew to a close, the verdict was inevitable. Nolan was found guilty of kidnapping, assault, and murder. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The judge's words were heavy with finality, and Morella felt her world collapse in on itself. She had hoped for some form of closure, some sense of understanding that would allow her to move forward. But there was nothing that could ever erase the horror of what had happened, nothing that could undo the damage Nolan had caused. The months following the trial were filled with a mix of grief, anger, and disbelief. The town tried to heal, but the scars left by Nolan's actions were deep. Tara's family, though devastated by the loss of their daughter, found some solace in knowing that justice had been served. Morella, however, was left to pick up the pieces of a life shattered beyond repair. Her relationship with her son was irrevocably broken, and though she tried to move on, the memory of what had happened would stay with her forever. She often found herself standing at the edge of the yard, looking at the house that once felt like home, now a constant reminder of the nightmare that had unfolded beneath its roof. The silence that had once comforted her now felt suffocating, and she realized that no matter how much time passed, the pain would never fully go away. Her son was gone. The boy she had loved and raised no longer existed. In his place was a stranger, a killer, someone she could never understand. The town, too, was forever changed. Nolan Fexley had taken more than just Tara's life. He had taken the innocence of an entire community, leaving behind a trail of broken hearts and shattered trust. The truth, though finally revealed, had done little to ease the pain. And for Morella, there was no solace to be found, no healing from the loss of her son and the horror of what he had done.